So the followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormons, are of course famous for that salty lake up in Utah, but around the mid-1800s, they were at odds with the U.S. government because their leader, Brigham Young, refused to obey the laws of the federal government. Sure. Do you know much about the history of Mormonism?
Just from a South Park episode.
Did you see the Book of Mormon? Because that's what I did for research.
I wish I could have seen the Book of Mormon.
Too. Yeah. It's kind of, it's kind of crazy. Like,
it's different for sure.
But I'm not talking about like the beliefs or anything, but just like their history, with the U.S. government is kind of insane.
Yeah.
Like, in 1846, the U.S. was smack dab in the middle of a war with Mexico.
Right.
And they were desperate for help. The West wasn't heavily populated by quote unquote Americans. By that, I mean white people, but you couldn't get any more populated or any more white than Salt Lake City.
Sure.
A mere hop, skip, and an 800-mile jump to Alta, California. So the U.S. Army asked the Mormon Church if they would put together a battalion of 500 men to help in the war effort in California. Brigham Young agreed, I assume, to try to get back in the government's good books, as well as their own good book. And the Mormon battalion marched south to San Diego and then a little back up north to guard the Cajon Pass in today's San Bernardino, then part of Mexico, soon to be part of Los Angeles.
Sure.
This was called the Mormon Battalion, and they were a special force that kind of maybe not helped win the U.S.-Mexico war.
Yeah.
So now these Mormons are guarding the Cajon Pass. They like this area so much that even once the war was over, many of them stayed, and a large swath of the Rancho San Bernardino was bought by Brigham Young to found a new Mormon colony. And it worked. They built a thriving city that was as big as LA was at the time. They even built the Mill Road, which was how a lot of the lumber that was used to build LA into what it is today got to LA from the mountains of San Bernardino. Compared to the wild murder fest that was LA at the time, San Bernardino was a lawful, prosperous town, except for one giant unlawful thing. They had a ton of slaves. They brought all these slaves with them from Utah. Okay, maybe two giant unlawful things. They were also terrible to the Native Americans living there, maybe kind of enslaved them too.
Wow.
So
I was about to ask who the slaves were. Now that makes more sense.
No, the slaves were black African slaves, or African, and maybe at this point African American. This was the 1840s. Remember,
1840s.
That was people still like that.
That's right. I forgot.
So they had black slaves, and they also kind of enslaved Native Americans, or at the very least, abused them.
Yes.
So this is what was going on in the Mormon paradise of San Bernardino. The Mormons were big proponents of owning slaves at the time, one of whom was Biddy Mason, who went on to sue for her freedom and became one of the most influential people in Los Angeles City. So she was brought here as a slave by Mormons,
one of
from
the
Salt Lake
mothers of Los Angeles.
Yeah. So yeah. So in 1853 was when San Bernardino seceded from LA and became its own county, but the age of the Mormons there did not last much longer. The tension between Brigham Young and the United States government did not subside despite the Mormon battalion helping out to, let's just say, take California from Mexico. And the general public didn't really look kindly on Mormons either, like around the country, not just the government, but just people didn't like Mormons.
Yeah.
They were abused in public and sometimes murdered by citizens, and sometimes the government themselves was abusing them. Because of this, in September of 1857, a group of radicalized Mormons, which I know sounds like a weird thing to say, but hey, any religion can have radicalized lunatics.
History has shown us you can be extreme in the most odd places, the most odd topics.
That's my favorite Bing Crosby song, Extreme in the Most Odd Places. This group of radicalized Mormons, they came upon a wagon train of men, women, and children heading west, murdered all 140 of these people.
God.
Their reasoning was that this was retribution for the way Mormons were being treated in America, and then they blamed it on the local Native American tribe.
Cool move.
Yeah. So
awful people.
When the truth came out after this, that it was a group of renegade Mormons, President Buchanan declared the state of Utah to be an open rebellion and, was preparing to use military force to depose Brigham Young. Also a weird thing to say, but it happened.
Jeez.
So before the Civil War of North versus South, there was a mini Civil War brewing of U.S. versus Utah. Like this almost
Crazy.
happened. So to shield his followers from the growing anti-Mormon sentiment and also to shore up his own defenses, Brigham Young recalled the people of the San Bernardino colony back to Salt Lake City. 2/3 of them left and San Bernardino lost its Mormon identity, but that 1/3 still remained and many of them made their way into the city that was still on a path forward. Take that, San Bernardino, Los Angeles. So this is how Mormons first came to Los Angeles. There's even old Mormon history here in LA if you know where to look for it. Right on the nose, there's Mormon Island in San Pedro, which used to be an actual island, but got filled in to be a peninsula in 1913 that's still called Mormon Island. This might have been named that because the Mormon battalion used to use San Pedro to load and unload things on ships, and that might be where the name came from.
Sure.
The Mormon headquarters in California was also moved to LA in 1906 from San Francisco after the earthquake, and by 1923, there were some 4,000 Mormons living in Los Angeles. As the population grew, they realized that they needed a temple to service the followers in town, and this being Los Angeles, the land of big choices, they decided to go big with it.
Yeah.
But first they needed land. And who do you go to when you need land in Los Angeles?
William Wolfskill.
Harold Lloyd. The clock hanger himself.
Why Harold Lloyd? Buster Keaton was busy that day?
Yeah, the loan rates of Buster Keaton land. Don't get me started. The clock hanger himself owned 2 million square feet of land along what is now Santa Monica Boulevard that he lived on and also planned to turn into a movie studio that he had bought in the 20s. So he owned basically like Westwood, Culver City, Century, like that was all Harold Lloyd's backyard.
Crazy.
Which is also a Bing Crosby song. By 1937, unlike the clock, he let go of that dream and sold half of this land to the Mormon church to build their new temple. So they got 1 million square feet of land. This was going to be not just the first Mormon temple in California, but the first one on the entire West Coast. It was going to be big enough to serve all of California. This was going to be the center of Mormonism in California. And then World War II hit, and Joseph Smith had to be melted down into bullets. It wasn't until 2 decades later, on September 22nd, 1951, that construction started on this temple, and it wasn't completed until March 11th, 1956 at 10777 Santa Monica Boulevard. The architect they went with was Edward O. Anderson, who was the official architect for all Mormon church projects. But when they started the planning on this, he was assigned to focus exclusively on just this temple because of its scale. And he set up his office in Harold Lloyd's old house.
Clocks everywhere.
They had Harold Lloyd impersonators build the whole thing. It was a pretty wacky project.
Great to watch, but it took years.
Originally, the whole thing was just going to be clocks.
It was going to be like a Big Ben, yeah.
Yeah, and multiple Big Bens glued to each other, but they couldn't stop laughing from hanging off of them, and it was just not getting done.
Good gag.
About 80% of these construction workers were Mormon working on the 1 million square foot project. Like I said, the structure itself is 190,614 square feet and 257 feet tall and was built to withstand earthquakes, and it has. Like, this is a massive structure. It has a 16-foot spiral staircase with 5.5 feet wide steps, 26-foot tall doors. There's murals everywhere. There's housing where visiting missionaries can stay. The surrounding grounds cover 13 acres and are filled with fountains, a reflecting pool, statues, and all sorts of exotic trees. And the entire area is built higher than the surroundings, which give it all a sense of seclusion.
Yes.
But the feature of it that we've all seen is the giant gold statue on top of it. Any guesses who this might be?
Harold Lloyd.
Harold Lloyd. You guessed it.
Yeah.
In honor of their founder, founder of the Mormon Church, Harold Lloyd. He's hanging off of what seems to be a clock hand. The only thing we know about Harold Lloyd. Yep. This is obviously a statue of Moroni. This is the angel that Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by repeatedly, who led him to the sacred text of Mormonism. I'm guessing it's he.
If angels have genders, sure.
Oh, if you've seen what I think, if you've seen what I've seen, this Mormon has a distinct gender. He's blowing an 8-foot long trumpet with his right arm, and in his left, he's holding the sacred golden plates that the Book of Mormon was translated from.
Okay.
The statue is 15.5 feet tall and had to be made out of aluminum rather than bronze because the law in LA didn't allow things that heavy to be put on top of buildings. So now he's a lean 2,100 pounds.
Oh, cutting weight every day.
Yeah. His resolution of the new year, he won't finish his golden plate every night. Originally, the statue faced southeast, but at the request of then president of the church, David O. McKay, it was moved to face due east to keep a lookout for the second coming.
Oh,
And the second portion, am I right? The whole thing cost $1.6 million to build, which is the most ever paid to build a temple, and was paid for entirely by donations from local Mormons. The open house lasted 2 months and brought in 682,361 visitors to see what this was, this giant building. It was the 12th Mormon temple built overall, and when it opened, it was bigger than the church in Salt Lake City.
Damn.
Until they expanded it a few years later. But for a little bit, this was the biggest Mormon church in the world. The grounds, visitor center, and genealogy library are open to the public, and they have been lighting up for the Christmas every year since 1979 that you can drive in to see. So grab the very, very large family and head on down.